Thank you to everyone for joining me this morning for this talk. As you can see, the title of my talk is Leader as Servant Inspector, and I want to introduce myself. I'm sure some of you I've interacted with, others may not have a clue who I am. So my name is Jason Ware, and I am a husband to Sharita, who is one of the most amazing humans I know. I am a father to Avery, our 17-year-old son, to Addison, our 15-year-old son, and to Autumn, our 13-year-old daughter. Hopefully, I am a good friend to many. I am also a clinical assistant professor in the Honors College, as well as the director of the Faculty Honors Preceptors Program and a managing editor for the International Journal of Community Wellbeing. And there are other things, I suppose, that you could know about me in terms of what I do, but I wanted that to be enough in terms of introductions, mainly that you know who I am, and I guess the role that I play within the university, or the various roles that I play within the university. I want to send out a big thank you to Asada and Hannah and the Purdue Student Government for inviting me to be a part of this week of leadership development, and a huge thank you to all of those who have made this week possible. You know, all of the vision, the effort, the planning, the stress. Thank you all so much, and thank you to those who are choosing to engage with me and my talk today. I'm sure there are other ways you can be spending your time, so thank you for choosing to share it with me today. And so, as I mentioned, the title of my talk is Leader as Servant Inspector. And so, as you can imagine, I will be talking then about several things. So here is an overview of my presentation. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about what I think leadership is, but I'll spend just a minute talking about that, talking about servant leadership, but also about inspecting your leadership relationships, inspecting what you expect of those you lead, and inspecting what you accomplish as a leader. And I'm going to be using narrative configuration as the structural framework for my talk. And it'll make sense here in just a minute, but I wanted to provide this overview in terms of what we're going to be talking about within the next few minutes. And so, as I mentioned, I'm going to be using narrative configuration as sort of the structure for my talk. And I will use a couple of different terms, and they all basically mean the same thing. So I'm going to use the term narrative configuration. I'm also using narrative inquiry. I think what would probably resonate most with most of you is just the word storytelling. And so I'm going to be using storytelling as the structure for my talk. And Donald Polkinghorne says that narrative inquiry is a subset of qualitative research in which stories are used to describe human action. And so I'm going to be using stories as a framework to specifically talk about the actions we take as leaders. And so I just wanted to provide, I guess, that bit of a background. Now, why use narrative configuration, or why use storytelling? What exactly does storytelling do? Well, from an academic perspective, stories are really a compelling mode of learning. I mean, think about when you were making your first campus visits, back when you were a junior in high school or a senior in high school, and you were trying to decide which college you wanted to go to, and you made your visits to campus, and more often than not, you probably interacted with some undergraduates. They may have been the ones who were giving you tours of various facilities, and they were sharing with you some of their personal stories about their experiences in this case, at Purdue. And I'm convinced that to some extent, some of the stories you heard from students that day helped you decide whether or not you wanted to come to Purdue. And obviously you did come to Purdue. And so stories had some kind of influence in that decision. And then also think about once you were on campus and you were trying to decide what courses you wanted to take, second semester freshman year or whatever. And you probably heard some stories from friends and acquaintances about certain professors, which classes to take and why, which classes to avoid and why. And again, those stories often influenced some of the decisions that you made. But more importantly than that, storytelling is the act of pulling together different events and happenings that occur over time and all of the human action that's related to various events and various happenings, and putting them all together, all those seemingly disparate events and happenings, putting them all together in a unified whole. And we call that whole a plot, right? And so I'm going to be talking about this whole notion of different events and different happenings and human action that are associated with all of that, and putting them all together in a unified whole or a plot. Basically, telling the story, you writing your story of leadership, you creating your story, your stories of leadership for this next academic year and into the foreseeable future. Now, there is a particular element of stories, like when we're thinking about narrative configuration. So again, I'm talking about stories within a scholarly perspective. And so within a scholarly perspective, when we're talking about storytelling, there is this big thing that happens, and it's called the denouement. And I'll talk more about the denouement, but it's basically the final part of a narrative, this big thing that happened, this really significant outcome. And so we're going to talk about the denouement and in relationship to your leadership. And so, again, still focusing on this question, why use narrative configuration? Why am I choosing to use narrative configuration to structure this talk? And what does storytelling do? There are a couple of things. I encourage you to use storytelling conceptually to frame your strategy as a leader for the 2020-2021 academic year. I encourage you to use narrative configuration as a form of collective evidence. All right? I think you probably read the description of my talk in which I said, I want to talk about how you as leaders, how we as leaders can make sure that we are doing a couple of things, one of which is making decisions that are evidence-based, as well as collecting evidence that we made something happen, that we had a particular impact. And so storytelling is, I guess you could say, a user-friendly way of doing that, of ensuring that we are collecting evidence. All right? So I'm going to say a little bit more about that. So the story as strategy. So I mentioned in talking about why we would use narrative configuration and storytelling, and how that storytelling is this act of pulling together different events and happenings and human action, our action associated with those events and happenings over time, pulling that all together into a unified whole that we call a plot. And I mentioned this word, the denouement, which is this big thing that happens. Well, I imagine that you've all in your respective student organizations have either started assembling, even if virtually, or are about to begin assembling to make your plans within your specific and perspective student organizations for the year. There are certain things that that maybe you do annually, like fundraising. There are certain activities that you engage in within your specific student organizations that you do annually. So my point is, you're making your plan for the year, for the academic year, things that you collectively want to accomplish within your student organizations. And so to some extent, then there is this big thing, this denouement that you are already planning for within your organizations, this big thing that you want to happen. So I want you to maintain that, to hold on to whatever it is that you're planning to accomplish collectively within your specific student organizations, but that I also want you to think individually. I encourage you to think individually as a leader about the things that you want to accomplish within your varying leadership roles. What is that big thing that you want to accomplish, that you want to be able to say you did by the time this academic year is over? So thinking of what that denouement is now, right? What is it that you know you want to accomplish? And then begin to work backwards from that. So in other words, sort of outline your own leadership story. Start that now. I mean, you're already starting the process of planning for the year in terms of organizationally what you want to accomplish. And I imagine that many of you are also in the midst of thinking through what you personally and individually want to accomplish over the next academic year. And so you're establishing your sense of purpose for the year and you're setting your goals. You're doing all of that now, but also, again, individually make an intentional and conscious effort to think about the various things, the big things you personally want to accomplish and achieve as a leader, and begin to work backwards. Storytelling is about, again, putting all of the different events and all of the different happenings and your action relationship to all of those things together into a plot to tell a story. Basically to tell how that big thing, the denouement, how did it come to fruition? And so I'm encouraging you to think the story then as a strategy. It's your opportunity to sort of strategize, not just what your story is going to be, but what those big goals are, how you're going to accomplish them, and how you will know that you've been successful in them. So thinking about the story as strategy, but then also thinking about the story as evidence, right? As I've already mentioned, there are many predetermined events that you're planning for the year. Don't let them just be these events or these things that you will do collectively within your student organizations. Make sure you capture them. And by capture them, in any way possible, keeping some type of a leadership journal in which you in your planning process for these predetermined events, you're capturing, whether it's in notes, whether it's in photos from the events, but capturing all of the details from your planning to the actual execution of the thing, to the conversations you have in the midst of something happening, capturing all of the many things that you are doing and not just being a participant. We put a lot of effort often into the planning of a thing, making sure that things happen just the way we want. And then we often sort of have these big sighs of relief when we're in the midst of them, and sort of fail to capture the significance of a moment. And there will be lots of moments, lots of opportunities that are leading up to events, that are in the midst of events, and then post events that I'm encouraging you to capture. So capture the things that you do. Capture the things that your peers do that influence you. Capture the things that you do that influences your peers. And then make sure to capture your outcomes and accomplishments. And by capture, I mean making sure you take notes, write these things down, collect all kinds of evidence. Why? Because the story is all about how you accomplished a thing, right? There's this denouement, this big thing that you've done, this big accomplishment that you've attained, these outcomes, these goals that you've realized. That's the big thing. But it's one thing to say, I did this, whatever this is. And it's another thing it's another thing to collect evidence that allows your story to be trustworthy. And so I'm using the story, and I'm encouraging you to think about the story as a strategy, but to also think about the story as evidence that you've accomplished something. And so back to what I'm really here to talk about, which is definitely all that which I just said, but I want to bring the focus back to leader as servant inspector. So let it be known that when I think of a leader, I really do think about a a leader as one who is influential. To me, leadership is all about influence, and it involves, for sure, knowing what your passions are, knowing what your strengths are, knowing what it is that you are gifted at, and using those passions and those talents and those gifts uh, and that influence that you have or that you earn as a leader and making things happen. You are all in various organizations, and I'm hoping that you have intentionally selected the various organizations that you are a part of because they are aligned with your sort of like personal mission, and they're aligned with the things that bring you joy, and they're aligned with who you are as a person, and will allow you to make very specific impacts and very specific contributions. And so within the various organizations or within the various roles, maybe you are in university residences or any of the hundreds of student organizations that we have, taking recognizing who you are as a person of influence and using that influence and your passion to make things happen. And the things that need to happen are, of course, dependent upon where you are, like what organization you're in and the various roles that you play in them. But again, leadership is all about, at least from my perspective, influence. And so that's just sort of the foundation upon which I'm thinking about leadership within the context of this talk. What I also want to then talk about as leader, as servant inspector, is this talk isn't going to be all about servant leadership, but servant leadership is really about, if you dig into it, and I know some of you have, many of you have probably already been in sessions even yet this week that have talked about servant leadership. It's certainly not a new concept. It's not a new theory. It's been around for a while. But servant leadership is where, it's about serving first, right? And it's about enhancing the growth and the lives of others. And I certainly want you to think about the lives of others at Purdue, but also beyond, because I recognize that many of you are involved in student organizations that have a much greater outward facing, a look and an effort that reaches beyond the university, beyond our campus, and that goes into other countries, that goes into other cities and states. And so enhancing the growth and lives of others, yes, at Purdue, but also beyond. And then in terms of inspector, I'm thinking, I don't know how many of you watch BBC films and or shows, but I happen to be fond of shows like Inspector Lewis, shows like Endeavor and Whitechapel, and these shows all are really about criminal investigations. And if you watch any of these shows, you will know that the investigators often have the term inspector in their title. So maybe they're a detective inspector, they're an inspector sergeant, they're an inspector. Really what they are doing is they are investigating crime scenes, and they're collecting evidence. While I am certainly not advocating that any of you are involved in any type of crime while you're at Purdue, the point that I'm wanting to make is that they are actively engaged in the act of collecting evidence. Something allegedly happened in each of these TV shows, and they're trying to collect evidence that proves that something happened, and they're trying to get to the bottom of whatever it was. And so thinking about a leader as a servant inspector is thinking about a leader who is really focused on enhancing the growth and lives of others, and is all about collecting evidence that they made that happen, that they did indeed enhance the growth, and they did indeed enhance the lives of others, and they have evidence that suggests that they did something, right? And so, as I've already mentioned, servant leadership is about serving first, which is why it's servant leader and not leader servant. And so coming to leadership roles and positions with the notion that that you want to serve, that is a desire that you have to serve your peers, to serve the campus, to serve the community, the greater West Lafayette community, the greater Lafayette community, because there are two different cities, and then of course way beyond Tippecanoe County, way beyond these cities, but out into the world. So the idea to serve first. Leadership often comes after service if you are servant minded, with the idea to, again, enhance the growth of others and to enhance the lives of others. And so leader as servant is, again, I'm flipping it to say servant leaders. And I have a very specific way that I would like to encourage you to think about serving your peers on campus. And that is this. I want you to think about this notion that as leaders, we often try, sometimes ineffectively, to motivate those we lead, right? Those who are in our organizations with whom we are working, but who may themselves not be in a leadership position. We try to motivate them to do something, right? You have collective goals and things that you're working on within your organizations, and you're trying to accomplish these things. And we are often happy to and excited about the leadership roles we've just sort of been, we've just earned. We've won the vote, as it were, and we're here, and we're excited about it because we've been intentional about selecting the different student organizations that we're in. We've worked hard to prove ourselves as individuals deserving of a leadership role. Now we have that leadership role, we're in it, and we're planning for the next academic year, and we want to do great things. And let's be honest with ourselves. Not everyone has the same level of passion that we might in terms of accomplishing a particular thing. And we have a lot of people among us, and when I say among us, I don't necessarily mean listening to this talk, I just mean on campus, who affiliate themselves with a particular organization because they want to be able to say they did it. Like they want to be able to put their role, their participation on a resume so they can then talk to a future employer about the fact that they did something. But their level of commitment to the organization and to the mission and to accomplish the things that you're meant to accomplish might not be as high as yours. And so we work hard as leaders to motivate them to step it up. We work hard as leaders to sort of encourage them to do more, to be more, so that we as a group can accomplish more. So we try to motivate them. And often our motivation is externally based. And if we actually want to serve people, serve our peers within our respective student organizations, I encourage you to take a very intentional approach. I'm going to throw out another word, and the word itself, like narrative configuration, isn't as important, but it's what the word means. And so there are varying motivational theories, right? And so I want to encourage you, as you're thinking about serving your peers, attending to their growth as whatever you want to fill in the blank, attending to their growth as individuals, let's leave it at that, attending to their growth as participants in your organization. I encourage you to not necessarily try to motivate them to do particular things in the sort of traditional way of motivating. By that I mean this focusing on extrinsic motivation, like if you do this thing, then you will be selected next year, for example, to be a co-chair of this committee. That may or may not work to enhance sort of the goal attainment. But I encourage you to think about intrinsic motivation. And so here's the word. The word is self-determination theory. Self-determination theory is a theory that really focuses on the fact that we as humans have basic psychological needs, and depending on the extent to which those basic psychological needs are met, then we are willing to, particularly in the pursuit of goals, then we are more willing to pursue particular things, pursue particular outcomes if our basic psychological needs are met. And this particular theory, self-determination theory, is focused on intrinsic motivation, which suggests that we are intrinsically motivated. In other words, we don't need somebody to sort of hold a carrot in front of us and encourage us to do particular things when we are intrinsically motivated. And so self-determination theory says those of us who are really trying to perhaps work alongside other people towards particular goals, we are more than likely going to see the positive outcomes that we want when we can create social contexts in which others' basic psychological needs are met. And those three needs within the the self-determination theory are our needs for autonomy, our needs for relatedness, and our needs for competence. And so, again, now you can abandon that self-determination theory in terms of the word and focus on what it means. And what it means is if we are working alongside people and we're trying to, as individuals, do great things, and we want to encourage other people who are working with us to do great things, we're going to have greater success. And we're actually going to be serving them better if we work really hard and are intentional at, again, creating a social context in which those who are working alongside of us can have a real strong sense of autonomy, meaning like we can create an environment in which those who are working with us have a choice, right? Like they don't feel like they are being controlled and they don't feel like they're being made to do something, but they then have a willingness to do whatever it is we are collectively trying to do. And they are volitional, they're making a choice. And it isn't just a free-for-all. I mean, it's within the theory, it's more considered choice within a structure. You know, think about food. Like I like to think about food and I like to talk about stories, right? And so if we go to a restaurant, whatever restaurant we choose, most of the restaurants, I should say, we choose, limit the options that we have, right? If I go to La Scala, which is an Italian restaurant in downtown Lafayette, which I happen to love, it's an Italian restaurant. And so by choosing to go to La Scala, I have already sort of limited my choices. Like I'm not probably going to be able to get a quesadilla there because it's an Italian restaurant, right? So I have the structure within that restaurant is that I have Italian food as an option. But when I sit down at a table, I have this menu of options and I get to choose. When the server comes, they're not serving me by saying, you're going to order this thing. Now they may bring to me the menu and say, here are our specials, but I ultimately get the choice. And so I'm sure you can make the connection. When your peers choose to be a part of a particular student organization, they've already made a choice to sort of limit some of the options in terms of the types of activities that they might be engaged in. And they've made a choice to be a part of your organization. And so that's then closed out some other options within your organization. But as a leader, there are still some choices that you can give, that you can help your peers, or those, I don't like to use the word, but maybe think about them as subordinates, those who aren't in a leadership position, and even maybe those who are in a leadership position, but might be at a different level hierarchically. But giving them the choice, right? When they have a choice and they can be volitional, then that's in some ways meeting their basic psychological needs, which means they're going to be more inclined to walk with you in achieving certain goals that you've established for the organization. The other basic psychological need within self-determination theory is relatedness. And the whole thing with relatedness is that we have this basic psychological need to care for and to feel cared for by those who are with us, right? And so this might seem like common sense. Well, of course we need to care for people, and of course we want to care for people, but as high achieving leaders, which I'm going to say that we all are, we are very mission minded, right? Like we have great things that we want to accomplish. That denouement that I mentioned, there are these big things that we want to accomplish, and there are these big things that we want to influence happening. And sometimes in the pursuit of the denouement, in pursuit of these great things happening, we have a tendency as humans to sort of not pay much attention, even though it's the most obvious thing, to the human element, right? That we're working alongside people who, at the end of the day, really do want to care for you, and they want to feel cared for by you. And when we do that, when we create a social context in which this care can be felt, this care is almost palpable, tangible, it's not about manipulating. It's about attending to our basic psychological needs in pursuit of greater things. All right. And then the third area, I can't think of the word at the moment, but is competence. That basic psychological need related to self-determination theory is we all like to feel like we can do something, right? And so when we are setting goals for ourselves and for our organizations, and for hopefully with those that are in our organizations, we want to do so understanding that we all like to feel confident and effective. And so if we task individuals with things that they do not feel like they are competent at, or that they can confidently do, then that's a disincentive, right? Like they're not going to want to do it. They're going to unplug. And so my point with saying all this is that we do indeed want to be a servant, serving those we're working with in our respective organizations. And when we are serving them by attending to their basic psychological needs of autonomy, relatedness, and competence, we are not just helping the organizations in which we're part of be more successful because these individuals will be more successful. We're helping them as well because we all have stories that we want to be able to tell about our success. And so in paying attention to the needs of those who are working with us and serving them by, again, focusing on their needs for autonomy, relatedness, and competence, we're helping them be successful. We're using our influence in ways that aren't just about us, but that are about other people. So again, leader as servant, leaders that pay attention to the needs of those they're working with, but also leader as inspector. Okay, and so I mentioned that I really like Inspector Lewis, Endeavor, Whitechapel, those types of shows because they're about collecting evidence. Well, I'm going to make this. I don't want to say assumption. I'm going to make this prediction. There we go. That there are so many of you who are going to have tremendous success this next academic year in your varying leadership roles. You are setting big goals for your organizations. You are setting big goals for yourselves. You have a lot of things that you need and want to accomplish, and those things are going to happen. It's just important all along the way, like starting now, that you are constantly inspecting, right? You have expectations for your peers. You have expectations for those you are leading. You're always going to want to be inspecting for multiple reasons. One that I'm going to talk about is collecting evidence that you've actually made a difference. But you're also going to want to be inspecting because you don't want to go from now until even the end of this semester just moving forward and not stopping to see the extent to which you are effectively connecting with your peers, without inspecting the extent to which you are effectively leading, right? So you'll need to be very intentional about determining times in which you want to sort of stop and inspect what you expect of yourself, inspect what you expect of your peers and those you lead. Be intentional about collecting evidence. And that evidence is not going to be DNA, right? Like we're not talking about that kind of evidence. I mean, relationally, right? One of the basic psychological needs is relatedness, the desire to care and to be cared for. Now, I'm not saying you stop and say, do you feel cared for? Am I caring for you enough? Do you have the opportunity to care for me? That will be very awkward. But seriously, to pause and to begin getting feedback. However you need, can, or want to get feedback from your peers and those you lead about your leadership, about the direction you're going within an organization, and get evidence of, don't just go on a sense, like, well, I sense or I feel that things are going really well because so-and-so responded to me in this way, or we had this particular outcome. No, you want to stop and get evidence that something is happening, right? That you are able to connect with people, and that everybody's on the same page, and that you all collectively understand the direction that you're going, and everybody feels like they're able to sort of be volitional, and that the choices and they feel like they have an opportunity to make choice. So it's pausing, and so that as you continue to move forward, you're doing so with evidence that what you've been doing is effective, with evidence that what you've been doing is actually working, so that you don't get to the end of the academic year and think, something didn't happen that was good, but something did happen that was bad, and I don't know what this is. I don't know how we ended up here. If you're stopping all along the way and sort of collecting evidence, you can make evidence-based decisions all along the way that feed into the things that you're doing, that feed into your effectiveness as a leader. You want to collect evidence in terms of the little small things that you do sort of day in and day out as a leader. But you also want to collect evidence in terms of the big things that you've accomplished. So my sense is that there's not going to be just one denouement. There's not going to be just one thing, this one big thing that you're going to accomplish over this academic year. Now, there may be one really big thing, but I feel like there are at least two different things. You're going to accomplish multiple things in various positions. And those accomplishments might be the multiple denouement there, like, because I know that several of you are leaders in multiple organizations, and so there are going to be lots of accomplishments within those organizations. But over time, right, like you are one individually, you are one person, and so while you might have many and varying leadership roles, and you're going to be accomplishing lots of different things in those roles in different organizations, you're still one person, and so you are constantly growing, you are constantly developing. And so there's sort of this overall development of you as a leader. And you can think of that as a denouement. And you can think of all of the sort of smaller accomplishments that you will attain as denouement as well. And remember, the story is about putting the pieces together, right? Like, you made this thing happen. This big thing happened. How did it happen? What were the various events that led up to this happening? What were the outcomes, and how did you respond? What did you do? You're going to want to be able to tell these stories, the stories of your success within organizations, but also the story of your development as a leader, right? And so how do you produce your story? Well, part of the pulling all the pieces together is you won't be able to produce your story if you haven't taken time to attend to the detail of events, to attend to the detail of various happenings and the things that you've done. And so that means you're going to have to be very intentional and pausing often and journaling. And I'm saying journaling, not that that's the thing that you have to do, but you're going to have to capture evidence and capture the details of what you've done, because it'll make that story trustworthy. If you just have this story that I did this thing, it's going to have much less of an impact if you don't tell how you did this thing, right? And there are multiple reasons why you would even want to tell your story. There are going to be additional leadership roles that you're going to want to go after. And when you're able to tell the story of your success, and it's not always just down to you, right? You're going to be working collectively with people, but when you are able to tell the story of your success, that's going to help you get additional leadership roles. Some of you might want to go to grad school, and they're not always just focused on your academic achievements. Often they're looking at just beyond academics. What have you achieved maybe as a leader? What contributions have you made? What impact have you made in the world on your campus? Telling that story is going to help you get into grad school. Also, telling the story of your successes and an actual story also helps you potentially with future employers. And so I'm encouraging you to be a leader that is a servant, but that's also an inspector. Inspecting because you want to make sure that you're making evidence-based decisions all along the way, but also an inspector because you want to be able to tell the stories of your success, not just for other people, but let's face it, we like to feel good about ourselves as well. And having tangible stories, as it were, is for us as well as it is for other people. So being being a leader as a servant inspector. So what I've talked about, seems like I've been talking forever, talked just generally about leadership as, being an influential person, a servant leadership, serving those that we are working with, both on campus, and I didn't really talk a lot about serving the greater community or the world, but the same concepts apply, but specifically attending to their basic psychological needs within the framework of self-determination theory, so looking at autonomy, relatedness, and competence, but then also inspecting your leadership relationships, inspecting what you expect of those you lead, and inspecting what you accomplish as a leader, and talk about all of that within the realm of storytelling. So that's what I hope you've taken away, is that I encourage us all to be leaders and as servants and inspectors. And here are some references. Everything that I said was based on some kind of theory and or experience. Thank you, everybody, for participating this morning. And I think we have time for questions. I'm not exactly sure how that's going to be facilitated, but.
Hi, I had a question about delegation. Here, let me turn on my video. Hi. I had a question in regards to delegation. So I know that I have a tendency not to want to overwhelm people with a lot of work, but at the same time, that puts a lot of work on the student leaders and things like that. So do you have any suggestions for the amount of tasks we should be delegating to the members of our groups and not overwhelm them?
Yeah, first of all, I think it's great that you're even, I think it probably is essential to delegate, so it may not be a matter of, it sort of just becomes something that you have to do. But in terms of how much, I will sort of defer to that whole notion that I mentioned of choice. So definitely delegation is good. But to the extent that you can make it volitional, so people having a choice in terms of what parts that they are doing in terms of the delegating, I think that's important, which I know doesn't necessarily speak directly to how much you should delegate, but I think it will speak to how you might want to delegate, is giving people choices. Now, there may be instances in which you give people a choice and they choose not to do something, and so then you're sort of left with, okay, I still have to do all of this. And so then it becomes a matter of you're going to have to delegate. And I think that it would depend, I think to the extent that you can sort of delegate among, if you don't have enough buy-in, I guess, or willingness from non-leaders in an organization, then it might be a matter of dividing up work between those of you who are leading, who are in leadership positions, and you'll have to make an intentional decision about how much each of you are feasible, can do feasibly, considering all the other obligations you have and time constraints, so that it's divided as equally as you can. But I think in terms of how much to delegate, you'll want to leave that up to sort of allowing people to be volitional and make choices in terms of what they want to do. And that brings me, I wanted to tell lots of stories, but I didn't have time to tell lots of stories. But I wanted to share one that's sort of about this whole notion of delegation. It was from when I was in my very first corporate leadership role when I graduated with my undergrad. I was a banker, and I had a staff of sales folks, and one of my roles was to help them sort of become experts within various areas of banking, so like trust management, investments, different things. But I was sort of, as the leader, the one who, I guess, had to know everything. And so what that meant was that even on like my days off, I was constantly getting phone calls because my staff didn't know how to do certain things. I mean, I was delegating to them, like I delegated, in my absence, and this is what needs to happen. But my staff, there were lots of things that they didn't know. There were gaps in their knowledge and their ability. And so I decided that I absolutely have to sort of cross train them so that every person in my organization knows how to do everything. Now, obviously that in an academic year, that's probably not feasible. So I'm not saying that you should do that. I'm just saying that it was within, as a leader, in terms of certain things I wanted to accomplish, in terms of delegation, I meant that I had to make sure that everybody knew how to do everything so that it wasn't down to me as the leader. Everybody had an ability to sort of contribute in a meaningful way. So that made delegation easier, because sometimes it gets to that competence thing that I mentioned. If people don't feel like they can do a certain thing, or like they aren't, they aren't confident in their ability to be effective in a thing, then they're going to say like, no, I don't want to do this thing. And so me cross-training everyone, making sure everybody knew how to do everything that we were meant to do, it helped with that delegation because it enhanced their willingness to step up to do something. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Other questions? All right. Again, thank you everybody who's on the call on this Zoom. And I guess to anybody else who might be listening, I appreciate your time. And I want you to know that you can reach out to me if you ever need to or want to this next academic year. I know that physical distancing is a thing. So I used to be able to host students in my office a lot for coffee and or tea or whatever. We may not be able to do that as much, but certainly email me. You can find me in the Purdue directory, or my email address is jaware@purdue.edu. Make sure you have that A after the J, otherwise it'll go to Jware at Purdue, who is not me. It's Judith Ware, who's retired from the English department. She gets a little cranky when she gets emails that were meant for me. Take care. Have a wonderful, wonderful weekend, and best wishes for this upcoming academic year.